Thank you. Thank you all for being here. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here. I'm honored by the fact that you came out to hear me talk today. So the heroic translators over there have asked me not to speak too fast. And I will try to keep relatively slow. If you see one of them trying to slow me down and I don't notice them, maybe they'll be going like this. So if somebody in front of me will do that to tell me to slow down so that they can turn my English into something that you can understand if you're not understanding the English. I tend sometimes to talk fast because I always have way more to say than I have time to say it in. And I sort of forget that sometimes it's more important that people actually hear what I'm saying than I make it through the entire list. So let me start by telling you where I come from intellectually. From what framework am I thinking about children's education? So I was a professor for 30 years. I still am officially a professor at Boston College, but I don't teach anymore. I taught for 30 years, and I'm in the psychology department, but my background really is more as a biologist. So I'm a biological psychologist. I bring a biological perspective to thinking about education. So I am actually an evolutionary psychologist, would be the term that would be used, which means that I am interested in natural selection. I'm interested in human nature. I'm interested in how human nature came about by natural selection, by Darwinian evolution. I'm interested especially in the nature of human children, and most especially in those aspects of children's nature that have to do with their education. And when I look at children, I see that all those characteristics that we think of as human characteristics for all of us, but we especially see in our children, came about in the course of the natural selection of human beings to serve the function of education. So my goal in this talk is to describe to you what those characteristics are, how they serve the function of education, how children educate themselves when we provide the conditions that allow them to educate themselves. So you should all have a handout here that you picked up when you came in. If there's anybody who doesn't have it, maybe if you raised your hand, somebody would come around and give it to you. I think it's useful to have that in front of you, not absolutely essential, but I will be referring to it from time to time as I go along. I'm going to follow the outline of this handout. So I've titled this, Why Play and Self-Directed Education are crucial to prepare children for an ever-changing future. To begin with, I can't really talk about education, certainly not about self-directed education, unless we have a shared conception of what education means. So what do I mean when I refer to the term education? I don't mean the number of years of school you've had. Usually when we talk about education in our culture today, if I asked you how much education have you had, you would say how many years of school or how many degrees you have and so on and so forth. But I don't equate education with schooling. So how do I define education? I define education as everything that a person learns that helps that person to live a satisfying, productive, meaningful, and moral life. So education is what you learn that helps you and helps society. It's not absolutely the same thing as learning. I don't talk about self-directed learning, I talk about self-directed education. Because we can learn all kinds of things that aren't necessarily helpful for our life. We can learn bad habits, we can learn things that aren't true, and so on and so forth. So I have defined education such that it is by definition a good thing. Education is that collection of what we learn that helps us to live a good life. A good life both for ourselves and a good life for society at large. So that's what I'm concerned about. So if education is defined that way, then what do I mean by self-directed education? By self-directed education, I mean those things that we learn that lead to a satisfying life and so on and so forth, that came out of our own self-directed activities, came out of things that we ourselves chose to do, and that came out of the everyday nature of life. So those things that we ourselves chose to do, whether or not we chose to do them for the purpose of education, and most often we don't. Most of our education is kind of a side effect of other things we do. We learn as we go through life. We acquire knowledge and information and skills as we go through life. So self-directed education is all that part of education that comes from the things that we ourselves have chosen to do, or comes simply from the day-to-day necessities of life. And so if every one of us thinks about our own education, who is it that we are, that we like who we are? What is it that we know? What are our skills that make us who we are, that give us pleasure in the world, that help make life meaningful, and so on and so forth? And I think we would all come to the conclusion that probably most of our education, no matter how much schooling we've had, is self-directed education. Most of what we really know and use in our life, most of our values in life and so forth, did not come from school. It came from our own self-directed activities. It came from the course of life. It came from our interactions with other people in the normal course of life. So that's self-directed education with small letters. And I would argue that we are all self-educated in that sense, that to the degree that we're educated, we're largely self-directed educated. So I like to use the term self-directed education with capital letters to kind of make it a brand name. For those cases where a family has made the decision that that for my child, all of education is going to be self-directed. I am not going to subject my child to imposed education. So imposed education can be contrasted with self-directed education. Self-directed education is what, if we're talking about the child, what the child freely chooses. Imposed education is what is imposed or imposed upon the child, whether or not the child wants it. Self-directed education comes out of your own inner motivation, your curiosity, your playfulness, your drive to advance yourself, your understanding that to do what you really want to do, you're going to want to learn this. It's all self-motivated. Imposed education is not self-motivated. It's motivated by rewards and punishments. And so when I talk about self-directed education, I'm talking about education that is not motivated by rewards and punishments. It's not forced upon the child. It comes out of the child's own desires and the child's own activities. So now I want to go on to, my research convinces me that children come into the world biologically designed to educate themselves. They assume it's their job to educate themselves. Why do they come with that biological design? Is because throughout human history, children have always had to educate themselves. Schooling is a brand new thing. Schooling is within just the last 100 or 200 years. We have always needed education. We have always been the animal that we have to, in order to live a meaningful and satisfying and productive life, we have to learn a lot of things. We have to learn about the culture that we're born into. We have to learn the language of our culture. We have to learn how to get along with other people. We have to learn the skills that are important to our culture, or at least enough of those skills so we can make a living within that culture. This has been true long before we ever had schools. Schools came about for a particular purpose at a particular time. And that would be a somewhat digression for me to get into the issue of why schools are what they are, but it's something I could talk about if there are questions about it afterwards. So children come into the world biologically designed to educate themselves, but let me be more specific. What is this biological design? What do I mean when I say they come into the world? I don't mean they come into the world saying to themselves, okay, I've got to educate myself. They come into the world with certain instincts that lead them to become educated. And so I've listed those under B on your handout, the educative instincts. And it's no mystery really what they are. Everybody who knows a child who's free can see these things in the child. Curiosity. You know, Aristotle, at the very first sentence in his famous treatise on the origin of human knowledge, Metaphysica was what he called it, the very first sentence was, the human being is extremely curious about things. That's the origin of human knowledge. We're curious. We are curious from the moment we're born until the moment we die, unless that curiosity is somehow driven out of us. Newborn babies are already looking around the world, trying to figure out the world around them. There are actually experiments with babies 2 or 3 hours old, and you show them a pattern. Then they look at that pattern, and then now you show them a choice between that pattern that they already saw and a new pattern. And lo and behold, they look more at the new pattern than they did at the old pattern. They're already as if they're saying to themselves, okay, I kind of got that one, but here's a new one over here. I better look at that one and try to figure it out. They are before they can move, before they're already exploring the world with their eyes. As soon as children can move, why are they moving? They're moving to get to things. They want to explore things. They want to get their hands on everything they can get their hands on. They want to squeeze it and shake it and drop it on the floor to see what happens if you drop it on the floor. Unless we lock them in closets or tie them up somehow, we can't stop them from exploring the world. We punish them for exploring more than we reward them for exploring, and yet they explore. They know they've got to figure out this world around them, and they are going to do it. Curiosity is not lost as children grow older unless we drive it out of them. Unfortunately, we tend to drive it out of them once they go to school, because once they go to school, their questions no longer count. Their questions are disruptions. The questions of the curriculum are what they have to pay attention to, and these are not the questions of most of the children. Once in a while, a question of the curriculum might be also a question of one of the children, but there's no way that with a classroom of 30 people and one teacher and a curriculum you have to go through, that you're going to be able to find that all the children in the world just happen to be curious about the thing that you think you're teaching right now. And generally speaking, to be quite honest, teachers aren't curious about those issues either. So they're artificial questions that they're studying, and they're learning that curiosity doesn't count. And curiosity tends to be suppressed as a result of schooling. So curiosity is how children, that's the drive to learn about the world. That's the drive to acquire information. Children are paying attention to everything around them. They're absorbing information, and they're thinking about it. They're not just passively absorbing, they're thinking about it. They're working it into mental models of how the world works. They are little children are little scientists. They're trying to make sense of the world around them, and they're constantly doing that. Playfulness is the complement of curiosity. So there's really, if you think about it, there's 2 aspects of education. One aspect is acquiring information, learning about the world. What's out there? What can I do with those things? The other aspect is acquiring skills. There's certain things, certain activities that we need to get good at. Curiosity is how you acquire information. Play is how you practice skills. The purpose of play is to practice skills. This is true for all mammals. All young mammals play, and you can predict what they will play at by knowing what the main constraints to life are for that species of animal. So, for example, predatory animals play at preying. They play at chasing and pouncing and capturing one another. Prey animals play at dodging and darting and getting away from predators. And animals that swing around in trees and need to do that to escape and get places play at swinging around in trees. Goat kids that live on cliffs play at prancing along cliffs. The things you can predict for any species of animal, what it will play at by knowing what are the most important skills for it to learn. Now, not surprisingly, from that point of view, our children, human children, play more when they're allowed to, when they're free to do so, play more than the young of any other animal. because our children have more that they have to learn than the young of any other animal do. They also play in more different ways than any other animal does, because we need to learn more different kinds of things than any other animal does. So it's interesting. I've talked to anthropologists who've observed children throughout the world, and I've especially talked to anthropologists who have studied and observed in hunter-gatherer cultures, the kinds of cultures that we presumably all lived in before a mere 10,000 years ago and with the invention of agriculture. And what they tell me, especially those who study hunter-gatherer cultures, is that children are allowed to play all day long, dawn to dusk. Nobody expects serious work from children. And childhood is defined from about 4 years old, when they're no longer nursing and need to be cared for by their moms in a direct way, on through the mid to late teenage years, pretty much what we think of as school years, they regard as childhood. Those are the years of play, exploration, and through play and exploration, acquiring the knowledge and skills they need to be successful in their culture. In hunter-gatherer cultures and in cultures throughout the world where children are given plenty of opportunity to play, they play at all of the kinds of skills that human beings have to learn anywhere to become well-educated. They play in physical ways, just like other animals do. They chase one another around, they climb trees, they wrestle. And this is how they develop their physical bodies. Children are not designed to run laps or lift weights or do calisthenics. I even hate to do those things. They're designed to chase one another around until their sides are splitting. They're designed to climb trees. They're designed to do all these vigorous things that altogether too often we stop our children from doing these days. Not only do they play in vigorous ways when they're playing physically, they also play in risky ways. They climb that tree higher than we might want them to because it looks dangerous to us. They skateboard down banisters. They dive off of cliffs. Turns out other young mammals also play in risky ways. And what are they doing when they're doing that? They're developing courage. They're learning how to handle fear. They're deliberately putting themselves into a moderately fearful situation, but one that they know they can actually handle. And they're learning that they can experience fear and they can hold their mind together. They don't panic about it. And they can hold their body together. And they come down, that little girl who climbs the tree higher than her mom would want her to do, she comes down a more confident person than she was before. She comes down a person who knows, okay, I can feel fear and I can master it. When she faces a real emergency later on in life, it won't be a new thing for her. She will know, okay, I've felt fear before, I can handle this. And the result might be that she would save her life, or maybe she would save her child's life, because she had played in these risky ways before. This is the theory that animal behaviorists have come up with for why all children, all young mammals play in these risky ways. And it's a theory that makes a lot of sense. Children also, so beyond these ways that we play similarly to the way other animals play, there are a lot of ways that we play that are uniquely human. Because there are certain kinds of skills that we humans have to learn that other animals don't. We are the linguistic animal. We're the animal that talks. How do children learn to talk? Nobody teaches children to talk. Children learn to talk on their own, and they learn to talk in play. The very first cooing and babbling, if you've watched an infant, is always playful. It's always in a playful spirit. They're just playing with the sounds. And as they begin to use first words, they're never asking for anything when they're first words. They're just using them playfully to point things out. They're just playing with words. And as they get older, they play in more sophisticated way with words. They become little poets. They talk in rhymes and alliteration and riddles and so on and so forth. And then when they're talking with other children, they're using very sophisticated language because they really need to communicate with one another as they're planning to play together. There's whole research dissertations done on what is called crib speech, where they've recorded the speech of the sort of monologues of a child who's alone in the crib. And it's almost as if they're doing exercises in the language. The child will sort of say the same thing over and over again and say it in somewhat different ways each way, as if practicing different ways of saying things. All of this is self-directed, self-motivated. Children are doing this. So children learn language in play. We are the animal that builds things. We're the animal with opposable thumbs. We are the animal that has always built our environment. For probably 2 million years, we've been building tools to use. We've been building shelters to shelter ourselves from the elements. We've been building means of conveyance like dugout canoes and so on and so forth. So it is not surprising that children come into the world biologically designed to play at building things. We call this constructive play. Children in every culture, when they're free to play at building things. What they build depends on the culture that they're living in to a good degree. So children in a culture that uses dugout canoes, they build little dugout canoes and so on and so forth. So this ability to build things, to use those opposable thumbs, to use the portions of the brain that connect to those thumbs and connect the idea, the image of what it is I want to build with the actual manual means of building it, these are exercised in children's play. We are the animal that has to follow rules. We are the species that we can't just behave in accordance with our whims and wishes and instincts. We are the animal that has to follow social norms. We have to do what's socially expected of us. Somebody who can't follow social norms, who just does whatever they feel like, we say that person's an animal. It's like a declaration. That person is not a human being because they're not controlling their behavior in accordance with the way human beings in human society have to control their behavior. Children in play are constantly practicing that. When children are playing, play is never random activity. It's always structured and organized activity. There's always rules to it. And when children play together, they share the rules and they remind one another about the rules. So children in play are practicing restraint. They're practicing controlling their impulses and instincts and behaving in accordance with the rules of the game that they have decided to play. So we want children to grow up able to control their impulses, and there's no better way that children learn how to control their impulses than through play. I think one of the reasons that we have so much diagnosis of ADHD today, I think partly it's what we've diagnosed normal behavior as abnormal, but it is, I think, also the case that many children are not learning how to control themselves because they're not playing enough. And play is how children learn to control themselves. I'll elaborate a little bit more on that a little bit later in the talk. Children play imaginative games. We are the species that imagines. Our way of thinking, the human way of thinking, differs from that of other animals in that we can think about things that aren't there. That's why we can be inventors. That's why we can think about tomorrow and plan for tomorrow. We can imagine things that aren't actually there. We can imagine ways of being and doing things that nobody's ever done before, and therefore we can be inventive and we can be cultural innovators and so on and so forth. We can think in terms of what philosophers would call hypothetical deductive reasoning. So we can think, so if this were true, then what else has to be true? As many of you might know, the famous developmental psychologist Jean Piaget argued that hypothetical deductive thinking doesn't occur with very young children. It only occurs when you reach 11 or 12 years old. But Piaget was absolutely wrong about that. Anybody who's observed a 3- and 4-year-old playing a fantasy game has observed hypothetical deductive reasoning. There's a troll under the bridge, hypothetical, right? If there's a troll under the bridge, well, we better not go under the bridge. Deductive reasoning, right? Children are engaged in that all the time. They're practicing the highest order of human reasoning, even when they're 3 and 4 and 5 years old and they're playing fantasy games. The development of imagination is so important to human reasoning and human logic and human development. And children, you can't teach this, but children learn it in play. We are the animal that uses tools to build our culture, and children everywhere are drawn to the tool to build our environment. Children everywhere are drawn to the tools of their culture. In hunter-gatherer cultures, children are drawn to bows and arrows and digging sticks and dugout canoes, whatever the tools are of their culture. In agricultural cultures, children are drawn to agricultural instruments. In our culture today, what are children drawn to? Computers. Of course they're drawn to computers. The most obviously important tool of our culture today is the computer, no matter what you're going to do as an adult. If you're a kid who's got the DNA that says look around and see what it is that people do in our culture and get good at it, because you're going to need to know how to do that, they're all going to see, of course, computers. I've got to get good at computers. So they gravitate to computers like flies to honey. And all too often, we try to stop them because we didn't grow up with computers. Many of us did, at least if you're my age, you didn't. And so we think that, oh, this is kind of an aberrant kind of thing, and this is going to be the ruination of human beings. And every time there's been a new technical development in the history of humanity, the older generation thinks it's the end of humanity. We've got to keep our children away from it, and the children know better. They know that this is what I've got to learn, because I'm not training myself for my parents' generation. I'm training myself for now, for my generation. So children are drawn to whatever the tools of the culture are, and it's no surprise then that they're drawn to computers, which is such an important tool in our culture today. So and no matter how else children play, children want to play with other children. Children are driven to play with other children. Solo play occurs sometimes. There's sometimes you want to be alone. Artistic play, you're doing something you don't want to be disturbed about. You don't want to have to talk to somebody about it. But by and large, children want to play with other children. In most parts of the world throughout history, children were always surrounded by other children, and they played with other children largely away from adults. And children are designed to become educated in play with other children away from adults, because adults spoil it in ways that I'll describe in a moment. So what are children learning when they play with other children? They're learning what I think are probably the most important human skills of all. They're learning how to get along with other people. We are the animal that, among other things, is absolutely dependent upon other people. We can't make it alone. All animals, all mammals need at least a mate in order to reproduce, right? That's the minimum. But we need even more than that. We need to get along with other people because we can't just survive as an island all by ourselves. So children know that, and they are playing with other children because they know they need to learn how to make friends. They need to know how to get along with other children. They need to know how to negotiate, how to compromise. And whenever you watch children playing together, you are seeing very sophisticated diplomacy in action. I wish that our politicians were as smart and capable as young children that I've watched, who are negotiating what they're going to play. I want to play this. You want to play that. I don't want to play that. All right, well, maybe we can come up with something that we both want to play. And so we talk about it. We come up with something that we both want to play. And then we begin to play. And maybe I'm a little bit of a bully, and I am telling you exactly how I want you to play. We're playing, let's say we're playing house, and I insist that you are the baby, and you're saying, I'm tired of being the baby. I was the baby last time. I'm not going to be the baby. And if I have to be the baby, I quit, right? And any self-respecting child, the most important freedom in play is freedom to quit. And it's because you are free to quit, I've got to pay attention to you. I want desperately to play with you. If I continue being a bully about this, you got to play just the way I want you to play, you're going to leave me. And that's the natural consequence of my not listening to you. So children in social play are learning to pay attention to one another. They're learning to distinguish whether their playmate is happy or not happy. And they're learning how to negotiate, how to compromise, how to get their needs met, while at the same time making sure that their playmates' needs are also met. What an important skill that is. What an important skill for all of human life that is. If you can't do that, if you can't tell whether your playmate is having fun or not having fun, if you can't pay attention to your playmate's needs and compromise that, you can't have a good marriage. You can't have real friends. You can't have real work partners, cooperative work partners. These are way more important than knowing how to read and write and know a foreign language and knowing the kinds of things that we get so concerned about in school. The truth of the matter is these other things are pretty easy to learn. And as I'm going to argue in self-directed education, everybody learns how to read and write, and they learn how to do numbers to the degree that they need numbers in their life. People learn what they need to know and what they're surrounded by. And if you're growing up in a literate and numerate culture, you're going to learn those things. And those are relatively easy to learn, but it's not so easy to learn how to get along with people. This is more complicated. And children need a lot of opportunity to play, to learn those things. The fourth characteristic I've listed on this outline is willfulness. So children come into the world curious, playful, social, and also willful. I should say a little bit more about sociability before I go on. I've talked about social play, but before I got into willfulness, let me make another comment about sociability. Part of how children learn, because children attach to other people, they know that connections to other people are very important. They are constantly learning from other people. They want to know what other people know. They are curious about everything in the world, but they're especially curious about other people. They're especially curious about what other people are doing. How are they doing it? They're curious about what other people know. They don't want to be told. They don't want to be taught. They don't want you to impose your knowledge on them. But they want to overhear you. They want to hear what you're doing. They want to watch what you're doing. And children throughout the world do that. They pay attention to the people in the world around them. And they're constantly learning from other people. They're paying attention to what you're saying to other adults. And they're learning more from that than they are from what you're saying to them. They are constantly attending to the world around them. They love to eavesdrop. That's kind of, I should probably explain what eavesdropping is. That means listening in to other people's conversations. So that's sociability. Now, willfulness. So children come into the world biologically designed to know that they need to connect to other people, that in some sense they're always dependent upon other people. None of us is an island. But they also come into the world with the complementary idea that I have to ultimately be in charge of my own life. I ultimately have to be responsible for my own life. I need other people. But I don't want other people running my life. I have to run my own life. I don't want to be subservient. I don't want to be a servant. I want to be the master of my own fate. I want to be the one who chooses who I socialize with. I want to be the one who chooses what I play with. I want to be the one who chooses what I explore, and so on and so forth. Already by the age of 2, children are asserting this independence. The terrible twos, as some people call them, where the favorite word of the child is no. No, I don't want to do this. No. And this becomes a bit of a problem sometimes in families. And we can't always go with the child's wish. And sometimes we have these battles with the child's will. But the point I want to make is this is a very positive. We have to think of this as really a positive thing about the child. When the child is saying, no, I don't want to do it your way, the child is saying, I want to be in charge of my life. I know that my job as a child is to become less dependent on you. And so to the degree that I can, whatever age I am, I want to take as much control of my own life as I can. Doesn't mean I don't love you. Doesn't mean I don't need you. But it means that I want to make my own decisions to the degree that it's possible for me to make my own decisions. That's essentially what that 2-year-old is already saying in saying no. And by the age of 4, children in all cultures where children are free want to get away from adults, away from parents, a certain amount of time with other children where they have to make their own decisions because there's no adult there doing it for them. They have to practice responsibility. They have to practice the art of taking control of their own lives. So that's willfulness. And then there's planfulness. So this seems a little bit less obvious. We don't necessarily think of children as beings that make plans, that plan their adventures. But if you think about it, all play involves planning. Whenever you play something, you've made a decision to play at that thing. Play is not random activity. Play always has structure to it. So if you're making a sandcastle, you've kind of made I'm going to build a sandcastle. That's a plan. And then you're following through and building the sandcastle. You're not just piling up sand randomly. Now, you might change your plan as you go along, but you always have a plan as you're going. If you're playing a game with other children, you're working out the strategy of the game. That's the plan for the game before the game ever starts, and then you're following through. So as soon as children are capable of playing, they're capable of planning, and they're exercising their planning ability. When children get a little bit older, they begin to even plan for tomorrow. So we're playing this game today, and we had to quit it because we had to go home for dinner or whatever it is. But let's continue it tomorrow, they'll say to one another. And maybe by tomorrow they will forget about it. They might not remember the plan, but they might remember the plan. So they're already planning a day ahead what they might do tomorrow. And my observation is that when children have lots of opportunity to plan, because they have lots of opportunity to take control of their own life, where they're not always being directed by adults and told what to do, so they have to figure out what to do themselves and make their own plans. By the time they're teenagers, they're already thinking far ahead. They're beginning to think, so, at some point, I'm going to not be supported by my parents anymore. I'm going to have to make a living out there in the world. How might I do that? What ideas do I have for doing that? What is my plan for making a living? And in order to make a living in this way that I think I might make a living, what is it that I need to know? What is it that I need to learn? And how am I going to learn that? They're thinking that way. They're taking responsibility for their own future as they're planning ahead. There's a study that's quite interesting that I think has to do with the early development of planning. That was an experiment that was, not actually an experiment, it was a correlational study conducted a few years ago by researchers at the University of Colorado in the United States. And what they did in this study is they identified a large sample of 6-year-olds. And by interviewing the parents, they determined to what degree each one of these 6-year-old children had free time to structure their own activities versus to what degree they were under adult direction and control throughout the day. And they gave them a cognitive test called a test of self-directed executive processing. This is something that is very intriguing to psychologists these days because it measures a skill that is believed, a kind of cognitive ability that is believed to be a crucial ability for employment in our world today. We live in a world where we don't need people who can do things that are routine, that do things that require micromanagement, because we've got computers and robots to do all those kinds of things. We need people who can figure out new ways of solving problems. We need people who can identify problems that nobody else thought of before and then figure out ways of solving the problems. That's what the employment world needs. That's what employers are craving for. They're not looking for people who are good at following directions. They're looking at people who are good at being creative and thinking of new ways of solving problems. Well, this is kind of a test of the ability to do that. And the way it works is sort of you're given the child is presented with a class of problem to solve, and the child has to work out a way of solving the problem and then consistently solve a number of problems using this strategy. And the result of that particular study, what not surprising to me, was those children who were least under adult direction, who had the most free time for play and exploration on their own or with other children, were least in lessons, were least in adult-directed sports, most often in their own activities. They were better than on the self-directed executive processing test than those who were often directed. Makes perfect sense. That shouldn't surprise any of us. If you haven't had practice solving your own problems and figuring out how to solve, because you've always been in a situation where problems have been solved for you, or you've been told exactly how to solve the problems. You haven't had the experience learning how to do that. So now I want to go on to the, I have to keep a little bit of track of the time here, but I want to go on to C on this handout, the crucial roles of play. I've already talked a little bit about play, but now but I haven't really said exactly what play is. I've talked about the different ways that children play and some of the skills that children learn in play, but I haven't really defined play. What do I really mean by play? How do we tell if an activity is play or not play? So here's my definition of play. I contend that in my definition, and that, by the way, of many other scholars who study play, play is an activity that has these 4 characteristics that I've listed on your handout here as A, B, C, and D under definition of play. So the first characteristic of play is that it is self-chosen and self-directed. Play is something that children choose to do on their own or with other children. And it is something that not only do they choose to do it, but they choose how to do it. They either create the rules or they accept the rules or agree upon the rules out of their own wishes. If a teacher stands in front of a classroom and says, now children, we're all going to play this, it's not play, because that's teacher-directed, that's teacher-initiated. One of the great purposes of play is that it teaches children how to choose their own activities, how to take initiative, how to go out and actually do something. And it teaches children how to direct their own activities, how to structure their own activities. So we adults are not doing children a favor when we take control of that. If children just go out on their own and create their own game of football, they are playing. They're learning how to create a game. They're learning how to negotiate what teams you're going to be on. They're learning how to make sure everybody's happy. They're learning how to create the rules and modify the rules of the game. They're learning all kinds of things that are way more important than football. When they go out to play a game of football that's directed by adults as a youth sport, they're learning none of that other stuff because the adult is doing it all for them. So we, by virtue of creating adult-directed so-called play, we're taking play away. We're depriving children of the important things that they learn in play. Second characteristic of play is that it is intrinsically motivated. What that means is that it's something that children choose to do just because they want to do it. They're not doing it in order to get an A on a report card. They're not doing it for a trophy. They're not doing it for a gold star. They're not doing it to improve their resume so they can get into a better college. They're doing it just because they want to do it. What's the value of that? Why is that a valuable component of play? It's a valuable component of play because one of the most important things to learn in life is what it is you like to do. Many commencement speakers at the graduation say to the new graduates, follow your passions. Well, where do you discover what your passions are? How would you even know what your passions are if all you've been doing is school? Children in play discover their passions because they're playing at what they like to do. And those children who are lucky, and in my studies of children who have been self-directed throughout their education, it turns out that it's not just sheer luck. A high percentage of them, at least 50% of them, go on to careers in which they really are following their passions, where they have developed some real interest, something that they love to do in play. And then as they become teenagers and they begin to plan their future, they figure out a way to make a living doing that. We live in this amazingly rich culture in which there are many ways of making a living that most children going to school would never even know these jobs exist. And many of these people, because we're a world of entrepreneurship, are inventing jobs that never existed and creating ways of making a living doing it. I could give many examples, but it would be a digression. But I could give many examples of passions that young people have developed. They've then gone out and found ways so that for at least as long as they're still interested in that, their life is a life of play in a certain sense. It's not fully play because now it really counts. You have to do it right because you're now doing it professionally and you're making a living doing it. So that's one aspect of play. It's interesting, there's a lot of research that shows that we can undermine play by giving rewards to children for what they're playing at. There's a lot of research showing this. If you take an activity that children like to do, and you do a study in which half of them get a reward, even just once for doing it, it changes their attitude about it. Now, instead of play, this is something you do for a reward. And the consequence of it, once they're rewarded for it, they now don't do it as much as they did before, unless there's a reward. They're thinking of it now as work rather than play. This is something you do for a reward rather than just to enjoy it. Of course, in school, we're motivating all of these kinds of activities with rewards and punishments. And so we're basically teaching children, we even call it that, we call it work. We're teaching children that reading and numbers and all the things you do in school, this is work. This is not something you'd ever do in play, right? And then we wonder why they aren't interested in this once they leave school or when they're out of school. We're undermining these activities as play by virtue of rewarding them and turning them into work. So that's the intrinsically motivated. The third characteristic of play, which I've already talked a little bit about, is that play is always structured. People talk about unstructured play. There's no such thing as unstructured play. Play is always structured, and it's always structured by the children themselves. If it's structured by an adult, it's not play. So it doesn't make any sense to talk about unstructured play. All play is structured, and it's always structured by the children. Play is never random activity. If they're building a sandcastle, it's a structured activity. They're building a sandcastle. Or think of what might look like the wildest, most unstructured kind of play. Think of a couple of boys in a play fight. They're swinging sticks at one another. They're chasing one another around the room. They're wrestling. They're throwing one another. Looks just completely wild. It seems really unstructured. But I would say, and any boy who does this or girl who does it, because it's not entirely boys that do it, but mostly boys, would be able to tell you very clearly how it's structured. There are rules here, and if one of them violates the rules, the other one will point out the rules. No biting, no kicking, no hitting hard. If you're going to throw the other person, you have to throw them on something soft. If you're the bigger and the stronger of the two, you have to self-handicap in some way. These rules don't have to be stated, they're implicit. But if one of the children violates the rule, the other one will clearly state it. Hey, no hitting, no hitting hard, and so on and so forth. So even what looks like the most wild kind of play is actually an exercise in restraint. It's an exercise in controlling yourself. You're going through the motions of a real fight, but you're not really fighting. You're going through the motions as if you're trying to hurt the other person, but you are not hurting the other person, and you have to control yourself so you're actually not hurting the other person. And I could go through all the sorts of play that you could imagine that we would all agree are play and point out what the rules of that play are. So play is how children learn to follow rules. It's how children learn to control their impulses and control themselves. So the fourth characteristic of play is that play is always imaginative. Play is structured, but it's never so firmly structured that there isn't room for creativity and imagination within it. Play is essentially being creative and imaginative within the boundaries of whatever the structure of the play is. And so children are practicing being creative within certain boundaries. And whenever children are playing, it's as if they're temporarily stepping outside of the real world into an imaginary world. And they're in this world where things can be different from the way they are in the real world. So they're engaging in hypothetical and deductive reasoning when they're playing. They're exercising their creativity in all kinds of play because all play is creative. Play is the most creative kind of activity that anybody can engage in. It is entirely creative, but within the structure of whatever the rules are. So those are the characteristics of play, and as I think as I've described them, it's easy to see why play, this activity that we think of so often as just trivial, is so beautifully designed to serve the function of education. The basic characteristics of play are such that they are the characteristics that lead people to learn all of these kinds of things that I have just described. Let me now spend a minute kind of summarizing what I've just said in such a different way, in a somewhat different way. We can think of sort of all of the realms of human development that are important. And I would say, I could make the case that play is the most important way the most important means of development of every one of these realms. So let's start with the physical realm. That's obvious. We've talked about that. Play is how children develop strength. It's how children develop strong heart and lungs. It's how children develop graceful movements as they play physically. What about intellectual development? I've argued that play is how children learn to think hypothetically and deductively. I've argued that children who have lots of time to play become better at executive functioning. I've argued that in play, children become creative and imaginative. This is all intellectual development. What about social and moral development? Play is how children learn to make friends. It's how they learn to compromise and negotiate. It's how they learn empathy. It's how they learn to pay attention to the facial expressions of their friends, to know if their friends are happy or sad, or whether they have to modify the way of playing in order to keep that person as a friend and keep that person as a playmate. So and what about emotional development? Risky play is how children learn to master fear so they don't fall apart in fear. And one thing that I haven't said, so there's a theory of play that's come out of animal behavior research called the emotion regulation theory of play. And basically that theory says that play is how mammals learn to regulate and control their negative emotions, particularly fear and anger. So I've talked about fear. What about anger? So children are not perfect. They get mad at one another in play. Anybody who's watched children play know that they get mad at one another in play. So play is an opportunity to get mad and to figure out what you do when you're mad. So if you're mad, let's say we've had this little play fight and we know the rules, but you've hit me a little too hard. And I'm mad at you. Yeah, that really hurt. That really hurt. Now, how am I going to react to that? If I'm a little kid, I might lash out and hit you back. And now we've got a real fight instead of a play fight. But that kind of ruins the play, right? I mean, a play fight is maybe fun for a little while. I mean, a real fight, if you're winning, is no fun if you're losing. But that ends the play. So that's not a satisfactory solution to it. Maybe you would have a tantrum, you'd have a temper tantrum. Temper tantrums might work with parents, but I've never seen a temper tantrum work with children. Children just don't respond positively to a temper tantrum. So what are you going to do with your anger? And what children learn to do, not everybody, nobody's perfect, we're all imperfect, but what children normally learn to do ultimately is to be constructive with their anger. Hey, that really hurt. Keep doing that and I'm going to quit. Be assertive about it, but not be violent about it. Make it clear that this was bothersome, but not have a temper tantrum about it. This is the healthy way of dealing with anger, not being a passive victim about it. You don't want to be a doormat and let other people beat up on you. But on the other hand, you continue to want to have a relationship with this person. Just because they hurt you this once, just because they've made you really mad, you don't necessarily want to end the relationship forever with them. There are some people you want to end the relationship forever, but if you ended up the relationship forever with everybody who made you mad at some point, you wouldn't have any relationships, right? So children learn that. They learn, okay, I'm angry now, but how am I going to express my anger, get my needs met without ending the play? And other animals do the same thing. There's actually quite a lot of research on how other animals learn to control their anger as well as their fear. And play fighting seems to play a big role in that. Play fighting is how animals learn how to be in close contact with one another, how to control their anger, and what to do if one of them does accidentally hurt the other one, either accidentally or purposely, but then they want to back out. There are actually ways in which animals apologize for that bite that was actually a little too hard, and it wasn't just a play bite, it was a real bite. So they apologize so they can get back to playing. In wolves and dogs, it's what's called the play bow. They back up, they bow down, head down, hindquarters up, neck up in a vulnerable position, which basically means, I apologize. I want to get back to playing. I'm not attacking you. I'm putting myself in this vulnerable position to show that to you. So these are the things that children learn in play. So now I want to go to D on this handout. The evidence that self-directed education works. So I've talked about the instincts that lead children to educate themselves. I've talked about how play is especially valuable in children's self-directed education. But what really is the evidence? What is the empirical evidence that we have that if we let children take control of their own education, that they will actually become educated by the way that I defined education at the beginning of this talk? And this has been the focus of much of my own research. I first got interested in this many years ago when my own son was rebelling in school to the point that it was very clear that we had to take him out of school. He just was a pain in the neck to the people in school. He was suffering in school. He was terribly unhappy. He was angry all the time about having to go to school. We fought with him through fourth grade, but by fourth grade it became clear we were not going to win that fight. And so we took him out of school and we didn't know what to do. But we found this school not far from our home called the Sudbury Valley School, about 2 miles away from us, a distance that he, by this time he was 10 years old when he started the school, could easily walk. We didn't have to drive him there. And we took him to visit this school, and he, after visiting, he said, "This is what a school should be. This is what I've been saying all along. This is what a school should be." So this was the Sudbury Valley School, and the way this school was operating was that it was a place for self-directed education. The staff members there did not call themselves teachers. They didn't consider that they were in the business of education. They were there to provide an environment in which children could educate themselves. There were children there from age 4 on through high school age, basically the same age range that hunter-gatherer kids are when they're free to play and explore with other kids away from adults. Quite a lot of children there, sometimes as many as 200 students there. There's a campus with an outdoor area. There's a big building inside. There's all kinds of opportunities to do things, various kinds of things, all kinds of tools for different kinds of activities, but nobody's required to do any of them. You can sit, if you choose, to do nothing, day after day, year after year. Nobody does that. Nobody does. And as my son says, who's still now a staff member there, it's actually impossible to do nothing. So unless you're in a coma. But you could look like you're doing nothing and nobody is going to bother you. Nobody's going to come over and say, "Don't you think you should do something?" There are some children who don't learn to read at the usual school age time of learning to read. Nobody gets worried about that. Nobody feels you've got to teach reading. Everybody believes at this school everybody's going to learn to read whenever they're ready and wanting to learn to read. So this is a school in which the adults do not try to control the learning. They simply say, "We're not controlling the education that's here. Every child is controlling their own education. Education is not something you can measure because everybody's on a different track. There's no point in trying to give tests and measurements. What you measure today has nothing to do with what this child is eventually going to be." All the children learn to read at some point, but they learn at very different ages. It would be very misleading to give a test of reading at any given age because some of them would be brilliant readers, but some of them haven't even started on the track of reading. But if you tested them the next year, they might be brilliant readers. So the whole idea of testing, the whole idea of paying attention even to what children are learning goes by the wayside with this kind of education. You simply have to trust that children are going to learn. And at first, that's very hard to do. And that was very hard for me to do, right? So I was happy that my son was happy. But I wanted some evidence that this was going to work. I'm a scientist. I know some people say, "I just know in my heart that this is right." I'm not really a heart person. I'm more of a head person. I have to know in my head that this is right. So my wife said, "Oh, he's happy. He's wonderful. This is beautiful." And I said, "But is he going to be living in our basement the rest of his life because he can't get a job?" This is more the typical husband response, right? So I needed data. There was nobody had ever done a study. The school had already been in existence long enough that there were graduates who had done all of their schooling there, what would be kindergarten through high school schooling there. And we're out now in the real world. I wanted to know what they're doing. So I did a systematic study with the help of a part-time staff member who helped me identify the former students. There were about 90 graduates of the school at that time who had spent a significant amount of their time there as students and had gone on to life, not to some other secondary school or primary school, but on either to higher education or some aspect of adult life. These are the people I called graduates. I was able to track down about 90% of them And the great majority of them, something like 90% of those that I tracked down, filled out this rather extensive questionnaire, and many of them I also interviewed. And the result of that study changed my life. I had been doing brain science up until then. I had been doing an entirely different kind of research. I said, wow, this is way more interesting than the research I'm doing in the lab. This is something that is just turning my intellect upside down. This is incredible. Here are these people who have grown up not doing what we think of as school, not doing what we think is so essential for children to do if they're going to succeed in our society. And lo and behold, they're succeeding in our society. They're doing well out there in the world. Those people who wanted to go on to higher education got themselves into college or university. Even those who had never taken a course before, never taken a test, never read a textbook. You know, we think that if you miss a few weeks of school, you're going to somehow be forever behind and you'll never make it into university. Here's kids who missed the whole damn thing, right? And somehow they got into the university. And lo and behold, they were not behind. They did well. Why did they do well? How did they succeed? I think there's a lot of reasons. One reason is nobody remembers what they learned in school anyway, so they actually weren't behind. Another reason is because they had learned something that's much more important than the academic skills that they maybe weren't taught and didn't study when they were students. They learned how to take control of their own life. They learned how to take responsibility. So those who went to college as a deliberate adult decision to go to college. I'm going to college for a reason. I have a reason to go to college. I'm not just going to college because I feel I have to go to college. I know I don't have to go to college, but to do what I want to do in life, I kind of need a college degree. The way things are set up, I can't really become a doctor, I can't become a lawyer, I can't become this or that unless I go to college. So I've got to somehow get myself into college. So they figure out how to do it. If there's a test you have to take, if you have to learn a certain amount of mathematics, in a matter of weeks, I've literally 6 weeks, they can learn all the math they need to know to do well on the math portion of the SAT test. They're already good at the verbal portion because all these kids have done a lot of reading. They're all very verbal. They've all got big vocabularies simply by being in this environment. But math, you don't necessarily pick up how to do trigonometry and calculus and so forth in the day-to-day, because nobody ever really needs it, and there's also no reason why you should learn it. But we have this arbitrary thing. You know, there was a time when everybody had to learn Greek and Latin because we thought it built the mind. Now we think everybody has to learn mathematics because we think it builds the mind. Whether they like it or not, whether they're really learning it or not, or they're just memorizing procedures, we put them through the paces. But these people, haven't been raised in a closet. They're bright, they're motivated. Even if they're not interested in math, they say, all right, I've got to learn this math in order to get into college. They set themselves to it and they learn it in remarkably short time. That's the difference between people who have taken control of their own education and control of their own planning and their own future, and people who, because they've been controlled all along, don't take that control, and they still need to be coaxed and encouraged and rewarded and punished in order to continue through the hoops that we put them through. Those who were in careers, as I said before, about 50% of them, I could trace a clear path between what they were playing at as children in the school and what they were now doing as a career. So just to give you a couple of examples, there was one young man who was, at the time of the study, was an inventor. People would go to him to have him build machines to do things that nobody else had built a machine to do. What was he playing at the school? He was constantly, as a kid, playing at building things. He was totally into constructive play. He would build whole villages to scale with modeling clay. He would build factories. He would build, at one point he got interested in distilling. He got permission from the school meeting to create a whiskey still at school as long as he promised not to drink the whiskey. So he was constantly building things. On April Fool's Day, he would set up the most elaborate April Fool's tricks in the school, and there would be some mechanical thing that would surprise everybody. So he was playing at building things. He went on. He somehow got the money together to get a machine shop, and And soon he was not only fixing machines, but he was creating new machines. There was another example of a little girl, of a person who, when she was a little girl at the school, played with boats on the pond at the school. There's a mill pond at the school. She was fascinated by boats. She would read about boats. She developed the idea by the time she was about 11 or 12 years old that she wanted to be captain of a ship. And so the school arranged, there's no ship on the school grounds, there's no ocean there, but the school is not all that far from the ocean. And so they arranged that she would go out she could take leave from campus and she'd go out to Cape Cod and apprenticed herself to a ship captain and learned the skills of being a ship captain when she was about 14 or 15 years old. And at the time of the study, she was a captain of her own ship. So there's many, many examples. I could go through countless examples. Just to give one who actually went to college, one of them became a mathematics professor. He was playing with mathematics as a kid. He discovered mathematics he claims through his reading of science fiction. He got interested in physics and science and ultimately interested in mathematics. And all on his own, he was playing with higher mathematics because he loved it. He found it to be this amazing set of puzzles. And so at the time we did the study, he was a graduate student at a very prestigious university in mathematics, and now he's a professor of mathematics. So those are just a few examples. So this really shook me up. First of all, it made me feel, okay, it's all right if my son stays as a student here. But then this is something that the world should know about. Here's something that just defies what most people believe, including me. And the people need to know about this. We don't have to make children learn. All we have to do is set up the conditions in which they can use their natural ways of learning. And then I began to do studies at the school and elsewhere to try to understand how they're learning in this way. What is it about play that's leading them to understand this? What is it about their natural instincts that's leading everybody to learn how to read, everybody to learn how to use numbers, everybody to grow up feeling like they can be in control of their own life? Probably shouldn't say absolutely everybody, not everybody, There are always going to be some exceptions. There are always people who have abnormalities or something, but essentially everybody is learning what they need to know to live a satisfying and meaningful life when they are allowed to do it under these conditions. I then pursued later on a study of grown unschoolers. So these are people who are legally homeschoolers, but the parents aren't requiring them to follow a curriculum or not testing them, basically have the same attitude as the staff at Sudbury Valley. And they're providing ways for the children to meet other children and to get involved in the community in various ways. So it's a little bit of a misnomer to call it homeschooling because it's by no means just at home. But it's unschooling in the sense that they're not following a curriculum. I did a study of grown unschoolers, and again, I found they're very successful in the world. The things that we worry about, that they wouldn't be able to get into college, that they wouldn't be able to get good jobs, just were not true. They were doing very well in life. So now I actually want to bring the formal part of this talk to a close before long. So I'm going to go a little bit more quickly. I won't try to talk more quickly. I'll try to be more succinct as I go through the rest of this outline. But I want to say something. We're now on E, the optimal context for self-directed education. So what I would argue is it's not our responsibility as adults to educate children, but it is our responsibility to ensure that children are growing up in an environment where they can educate themselves. And what are the characteristics of that environment? And so what I have listed here is the aspects of the Sudbury Valley School and other schools that have been modeled after the Sudbury Valley School, other democratic schools that have a similar philosophy. What are the characteristics of those schools, which are shared by a hunter-gatherer band, which is the kind of situation where children, for presumably millennia, were educating themselves? What are these environmental characteristics? So I've listed them here as 1 through 6 under E on your handout. So the first characteristic is the social expectation and reality that education is children's responsibility. I've been saying over and over again that children come into the world believing it's their responsibility. They act as if that's their responsibility. They start exploring and playing and socializing and paying attention in ways that make it clear that in their DNA they know they have to educate themselves, and they're doing that. But we can talk them out of it. We can at least partially talk them out of it. If we tell them over and over again that these things you're doing is a waste of time, and that the way you become educated is by doing what we're telling you to do. You do what we tell you to do and you'll become educated. Then they can lose this sense that they are responsible for their own education. They buy into our claim, our claim that we are responsible for their education, that we've determined what they have to do and what they have to learn and how they have to learn it. And that leads them to stop being responsible for their own education. So that's the first characteristic. We can't act as if adults educate children. We have to act as if, which is true, that the children educate themselves. We can help out where they ask for help, but we can't control it. We can't direct it. We can't know for any given child what that child should be doing at that point to maximize their education, but the child knows. And we have to trust the child to know that. So that's the first characteristic. The second characteristic is unlimited freedom to play, explore, and pursue their own interests. I've already said that in hunter-gatherer cultures, children play from dawn to dusk. They have very little chores are expected of them. They are free to play from age 4 on through their mid to late teenage years all day long. And they are playing, I've done research surveying anthropologists about what they're playing at. They're playing at all the kinds of activities that hunter-gatherers need to learn to be successful in their culture. Not because anybody's encouraging them to, or requiring them to, or measuring their ability at, just because it's natural for children to do that. And so children need more than an hour a day to play, or 2 hours, or 3 hours, or 4 hours. They need lots of time. They need more or less unlimited time to play and explore and pursue their own interests. They need time to dabble in this and dabble in that. They need time to get bored and try to figure out what they want to do. They need time to immerse themselves in something that's a serious interest, where they're maybe just doing that for a long period of time. They're doing it over and they're immersing themselves. They're really getting deeply into whatever they're doing, and then maybe they'll go on and get deeply into something else. That can't occur if every hour or 2 hours they're being interrupted. Now you've got to stop and go do something else because we're telling that you have to do something else. You can't really develop a passionate interest in school because you don't have enough time to really develop that passionate interest. If you focus on one thing too long, you're neglecting the other things that you're being told that you have to do. The fourth characteristic, or the third characteristic, is opportunity to play with the tools of the culture. So if children are going to learn how to use the tools of the culture, they have to have access to the tools, and they have to be allowed to play with those tools. And what I mean by play with the tools is do your own thing with the tools, do creative things with the tools, not just follow a set of prescribed steps that somebody is teaching you to do. In order to really be comfortable with a tool and know what you can do with it, you have to be creative with that tool, learn how to use it. And so it's very important that children have access to the major tools of the culture. What are these tools? I've already said the computer is probably the most important tool. But in addition to that, you want to have in such a setting cooking equipment. Children love to cook. Cooking is still an important skill in our environment. You want to have maybe woodworking equipment. You want to have equipment for art, and equipment for sports, and equipment for thinking of the things that many people like to do in our culture, that many jobs depend on skills and with these kinds of things. And you want to make these available to children, and you want to make them freely available to children so children can actually play in their own ways on these things and have plenty of time to do so. The fourth characteristic is access to a variety of caring adults who are helpers, not judges. So there's quite a lot in that little statement. A variety, caring, helpers, not judges. So you want more than one adult. And ideally, you want a number of adults who are different from one another. You want adults who represent kind of different ways of being an adult. You want adults of different personality. And maybe you want adults with different knowledge, but that's less important than different personality because the children can find knowledge easily. That's not a big problem in this day and age. But you want one adult at least who has the kind of lap you would want to sit on and shoulder you'd want to cry on when you need an adult for that purpose. And maybe you'd want another adult to go to for a political argument if that's what you're craving for at the moment. And so it's good to have different adults and children are very good at figuring out the characteristics of different adults. And when they need to go to an adult, which isn't all that often for most children, they know which adult to go to. So a variety of adults, but who are helpers, not judges. If you are judging the child, if you as the adult there are also determining who's best and who's worst, if you are determining who passes or who fails, or who's in the top of the class or who's only second in the class, then you are putting yourself into a position with that child where that child is always going to be anxious around you. That child is always going to be concerned about your judgment. That child cannot be fully authentic with you, cannot be fully honest with you. When we are around people who are evaluating us, we're always going to be on somewhat impression management mode. And the staff members at a Sudbury school don't want the children to be on impression management mode when they're interacting with them. They want them to be honest and genuine and authentic. And so they don't want to be in the position of ever judging the children. They want to be in the position of kind of unconditional acceptance of the children. And that's what they put themselves into. And that's very similar to what the anthropologists tell me is true of the adults in the hunter-gatherer culture. They don't evaluate the children. They love the children. They're there when the children need them. They're glad to offer help and advice when the children want it, but they don't impose themselves upon the children and interrupt their activities. The fifth characteristic, which I've done, has been the focus of a lot of my own research, is free age mixing among children and adolescents. One of the worst things we do in our culture is to segregate children by age. Children in past history were never segregated by age until we had age-graded schools. Children always interacted across ages. They always played with children who differ from themselves in age. In a hunter-gatherer culture, by necessarily they do, because a hunter-gatherer band is small enough that there wouldn't be enough children to play with if you only played with children your own age. So a typical play group in a hunter-gatherer culture might be a group of kids who range from age 4 to age 12, or a group of kids that range in age from age 8 to 16, and they're all playing together. And that's also true at Sudbury Valley School. That I've done studies of age mixing at the school, and even when they've had as many as 200 kids, there's enough kids you could, in theory, just play with people your own age. Doesn't happen. Turns out the older kids love to play with younger kids, and the younger kids love to play with older kids. And there's no sacrifice in the play. When they're playing together, the older kids are boosting the younger ones up to a higher level of play. They're working out a way of playing such that everybody's playing at their maximum ability, creating ways to make it fair and even and fun for everybody and challenging for everybody, which also makes the play more creative. And the play is less competitive when it's age mixed, because of course, if the older and bigger and smarter one really wants to beat the younger one, they always can, and everybody knows that. So the goal is not to win, the goal is to have fun. The goal is to figure out how to make this challenging and interesting for everybody and to have fun. So older children are constantly teaching younger children in play, not because they're deliberately educating the younger children. They would laugh at that idea. Just because to play the game, they have to teach the children what it takes to play the game. If you're playing a game that involves reading, some of the kids can't read, you're pointing them, okay, this word on the computer screen, this is this word, remember that. That's what this word means. I don't want to have to keep reading it to you. And so they're pointing out words, they're showing what these words are. I've even heard kids say to other kids, often at the computer screen, well, there's a code here. It's this word is this, and we can sound it out here, and this will help you be able to think about what the next word is. They're actually teaching reading in the context of just playing a game. And it's meaningful to the kids. They're learning it for a real purpose. It's meaningful to them right there, and they're learning to read very rapidly. Also, the presence of older kids, even when they're not playing together, inspires the younger kids to higher levels of activity. So children, just to continue with reading as the example, children who can't read, say 4 and 5 and 6-year-olds who can't read, are seeing somewhat older children reading and enjoying reading. Maybe they're reading comic books and laughing together about the comic books. Or maybe there's a group now reading Harry Potter and they're really into the Harry Potter stories. And the younger children see the older children doing this. They see these cool older kids doing this and they want to do it. They want to join that club. If they see adults reading, that's no big deal. Adults are kind of in a whole different world. But if they see children a little older than themselves doing it, that's real motivation. If so-and-so could do it, I probably could do it too. And they are striving to do it. It's not just that the older kids are helping the younger kids are also helping the older kids. The younger kids are so full of energy and they're so creative that they are sort of that energy and the creativity rubs off on the older kids. So older kids who might come to the school kind of burned out by public school. It's hard to feel burned out and cynical about the world if there's a bunch of happy little kids wanting you to give them a piggyback ride. So the younger kids are helping maintain a high spirit and creativity among the older kids. And also when the older kids are teaching the younger kids something, they are consolidating their own knowledge as they teach. They're also learning how to be nurturers and caretakers, and this is at least as important as the things that the younger kids are learning in these interactions. So the sixth characteristic is immersion in a stable, moral, caring community. And so this represents the point that education is not just for your own selfish purposes. If you're growing up in a Sudbury school or another democratic school or the kind of learning community that are springing up all over the world for self-directed education, you develop a sense, not that I'm just a lone individual in this world who has to look out for myself. I'm part of a community. I'm part of this school. I'm an integral part of this school. At Sudbury Valley, you have a vote at making any of the rules at the school. Everybody votes. There's long discussions about what the rules should be, and then there's a vote about the rules. If somebody violates a rule, there's a procedure that all the children are involved in for determining whether they actually did violate the rule and what should be the consequence, if there should be some consequence, how to mediate the problem, and so on and so forth. They're constantly involved in this. They're constantly involved in moral and ethical discussions that have to do with the whole community, not because this is part of any curriculum, but this is just part of how you run the school. This is what you have to do in any community to make the community work. And they're learning that in a first-hand way. And one of the things that many of the graduates told me in my study of the graduates was that this was a very important part, they felt, of their education, was learning to take responsibility not just for themselves, but for the community in which they lived. And that generalized. Once they left the school, they felt they had more sense of responsibility about the town they lived in, or the state they lived in, or the nation they lived in, or the world they lived in, to try to be a good citizen, to try to make the world better, because of the fact that they had grown up with this sense that the job is to make the community better, where they were learning this in a more manageable situation of this very small community of the school that they were growing up in. So I'm going to, because this has gone on fairly long and I want to leave some time for questions, I'm not going to talk about the final points on this outline, except to say that I want to say in just a few words why I think now is the right time for self-directed education to take off. We're now kind of on F at the outline. And I'm not going to elaborate on it. I've written a lot about this. You can find references to it on the back of the form. You can find blog posts I've written about it on my Psychology Today blog. But let me just list these so that then we can go on to some questions and answers. So these ideas have been around for a long time. None of this is brand new. Summerhill, which was one of the first places for self-directed education, has been around for over 100 years. People have been talking about these ideas forever. Sudbury Valley is 51 years old. It's not a brand new thing. This is not a new experiment. This is a tried and true thing. It's been around. There's a lot of data about it. We know it works. The idea of unschooling has been around at least since around 1970 when Holt coined the term. There are many philosophers who've talked about self-directed education. We know that most of the great people in history who've contributed most to our culture were claimed that everything they learned that was important to what they did was learned under their own motivation, not through school. So these ideas are not new, but yet they haven't taken off. They haven't caught fire. They haven't spread as one would think they would spread if you understood that these work, that you don't have to force children to learn. We don't have to put all this expense and trouble to it. All we have to do is provide the conditions in which they can learn. I think the time is ripe for this to occur for the reasons that I've listed here. One is schooling has progressed, has grown in weightiness, so it is increasingly obvious that it's harmful to children. In the United States, as schooling has become taken over more and more of children's time, as there's more and more testing, more and more homework, less time for free play and self-directed education, the rate of suicide has been increasing parallel to that. The rate of suicide among school-age children is much higher during the school year than it is during the summer. There are studies that show that in the United States that high school-age kids are the most stressed out people in America. They're more stressed out than their parents are. They're more stressed out than anybody else is. And 83% of them, when asked what's your primary source of stress, say school. School is quite literally driving people crazy, driving young people crazy. We've carried it to such an extreme. And now we're doing it to younger and younger children. I've heard there's actually a kind of rebellion among kindergarten teachers in one of the communities near where I live. They're saying for the first time in their life, they're hearing kindergarten children saying, "I hate school." Usually they didn't hear that until about middle school. Now it's down to the kindergarten because we're driving kindergarten children crazy. No longer is kindergarten a place to play and explore and have fun. It's a place to do worksheets. It's a place where they're being told they're fallen behind. They're already being placed under stress when they're 4 and 5 years old. And this is criminal in my view. This is child abuse. And it is becoming the school system. And I use these words carefully. I use these words advisedly. This is not rash, I don't think, for me to say that increasingly school has become state-mandated child abuse. What we are doing to children in school, children are simply not designed to be spending so much time sitting in their seats, doing boring work over and over and over again. They're designed to be running around, having fun, making up their own things. It used to be not so terrible. When I was a student, I had lots of time after school and when school wasn't in session to run around and for self-directed learning. We had 6-hour school days, but 2 of those hours were outdoors. We had an hour of free play at lunch hour. We had a half hour in recess in the morning, half hour recess in the afternoon. We were never in our seats for more than an hour at a time. People in the 1950s in America didn't believe that children should be spending all that time in school. And we never had homework in elementary school. So over the time, there's been this gradual change. Every decade, we pour more and more onto the backs of school children. And now we see finally their backs are breaking. And parents are seeing that. And parents are recognizing school is harming their children, and more parents are taking their children out of school. There's been a rapid growth of homeschooling in the United States, and among the homeschoolers, there's been an even more rapid growth of unschooling. It's becoming more and more common. So that's one thing that's happened. Another thing that's happened is there's increased evidence that self-directed education works. I think I'm partly responsible for that. I've done a lot of research on it. I've published in major journals. I was recently asked by the editors of the Oxford Encyclopedia of Educational Research to write a chapter for the new edition of it on self-directed education. This is the first time that's ever happened. So here's a major compendium of education that is asking for a chapter on self-directed education. What do we know about the research? This is beginning to be acknowledged officially by people who think about education. We should not just have a chapter about Montessori, about Waldorf, and so on. We should have a chapter about self-directed education. It's now in that same category. We can think about it as a normal approach of education. That, of course, makes it a lot easier for people to do it. If there are university people talking about it, there's research on it, there's major journals writing about it, it becomes a little less scary for people to do it. And also, as you know more people who've done it, as gradually more and more people who are doing it, it becomes less scary to do it. So I think we're going to reach a tipping point where there's enough people doing it and there's enough evidence out there that at some point the gates are going to open and everybody's going to move in that direction. The third reason is the increased ease of pursuing self-directed education. You know, there was a time in history, quite a long time ago, where knowledge was sequestered in schools. You kind of had to go to a school in order to acquire knowledge. It wasn't freely available out there. And so the only way you could learn what you wanted to know was to go to a teacher and a school and a curriculum. That's no longer true, and every child knows it's no longer true. You carry the world's knowledge right here. You don't have to seek it out. You don't have to find. You can with a few clicks of your thumb, you can hear the biggest expert in the world talking about whatever you're interested in and talking about it in a way that you can understand it. You can find YouTube showing you how to do anything you want to do. This is just an incredible tool. It's an amazing tool. This has opened up. It has really made schooling obsolete. You don't have to go to school to acquire information and knowledge. And you certainly don't have to go to school to learn skills. There's all kinds of ways of learning skills. So that's part of it. And then the final part has to do with the fit between self-directed education and our modern economy. In the past, you could kind of rationalize school as it existed. You could say, well, you know, work is really boring. And so we need to train our students to do boring stuff. We need to put them through the paces of doing this and that so that they will go through the paces of doing this and that in their boring jobs that they're going to have when they graduate. That's a pretty sad view of human development. But I've actually heard that argument, and it used to be a pretty common argument. But we don't have those boring jobs now. You can't get an assembly line job. Maybe there's a few of them out there. What the economy needs is people who are, in order to make a living in this world, you've got to be able to learn on the job. You've got to be able to, no matter what you're doing, there's going to be new ways of doing it. Technology is constantly changing. You've got to not be afraid of learning new stuff. You've got to be willing to take responsibility. You're not going to get into a job and it's going to be the same job the rest of your life as was once true. You've got to be flexible. You've got to be ready to take control. You've got to be creative. You've got to figure out how to create ways of making your living. So we don't need people who can answer questions that have already been answered because they're all here. All we have to do is look those things up. You don't need to keep in mind the map of what's the capital of every country in the world. No need to keep that. You can find that out in a second. So that's just a waste of mental energy to learn all that stuff. You don't need to be able to do routine calculations. It doesn't matter if you can do long division or not. You've got calculators for doing that. You do want to know the logic of it when you would do long division, but that's something you need to know if you're actually doing some work or project in which you do need to know why you would do that, and people learn it in the context of that. So we are at a time in our history where more than ever before, we need people who are creative. We need people who can think outside the box. We need people who can ask questions that nobody else has asked before and who can find answers to questions that nobody has found answers before. We don't need people who can answer one right answer multiple choice questions where the answer is already predetermined. And yet, more than ever in the past, we are training people to answer one right answer multiple choice questions. We've taken away much of the creative activities from our school, and we've taken away much of children's play, which is most creative. And the result of that is we are not producing young adults who are well fit for the economy today. So I thank you very much for your kind attention, and I'm going to take a little bit of just a pause now, and then I think we're going to have some time for questions and answers. And if anybody has to leave for any reason at all, don't feel embarrassed about just getting up and leaving. Even I don't want people to feel that you have to stay longer than you feel that you want to stay. This is all self-directed, right? Thank you. And now I believe we've got time for a few questions. And if you have a question, and raise your hand, Katie will come with the microphone.
Hello. So my name is Rudy. I have a question. It's more relating to our daughter. She's a teenager. And you were talking about providing environment to make sure children can actually do what they feel like doing and what they're passionate about. So maybe in our case, I was thinking, as teenagers, sometimes they go through a lot of things. And either way we can help our own children really find what they're passionate about and what could be their purpose. So do you have any tips?
Yeah, I think it's not so much up to you to help your child find those as to provide the opportunity such that your child can find them herself. So the good thing about a Sudbury school is there's lots of things going on. There's lots of things one can do. There's children doing various things. Children play at this and they play at that. And it's not so much that parents or any particular adults have to help the child find what their passions are. The child just finds them because there are things to do. So I think the degree to which you can provide an environment in which your child is surrounded by people doing interesting things. And then when your child discovers, even if it's just something that she wants to do for a short period of time, you allow her to do it and you help her find the means to do it. That may require something. It maybe requires a trip to a museum, or it maybe requires an opportunity to go camping or something like that. Or to, I think adults have the responsibility, because children don't have access to the means, of helping children find the resources that they need to pursue what they think they're interested in.
Hi. So my question is, you've mentioned that all technology, iPads, iPhones, are extremely appealing to children. Yes. So should we allow it freely? Because, to me, I'm a little bit concerned that if it happens, it's very easy to develop an addiction, and then it's the whole different problem.
Right. Yeah, this is, in this case, this was the second question asked. Usually that's the first question. And because it's so often asked of me, at first I didn't know how to answer it. And so I have spent a lot of time digging into the research literature on effects of computer play, of so-called screen time, and so on. At one point, when I started this, I Googled harmful effects of computers on children. And I came up with this long list. I sort of ended up concluding that we've decided that all of the maladies of adolescence, with the possible exception of acne, are the result of computers. So you can easily find this list. There's just, people think playing violent video games makes kids violent. Gameplay, especially it's video games people are concerned about, but people are also concerned about social media and YouTubes and all the other things. There's claims that it ruins your eyes. There's claims that it creates social isolation, so children don't know how to get along with other children. There are claims that it is addictive, so children get trapped into it and then they can't quit even if they want to quit. So I made this list and I looked at what actually is the evidence for these claims. And I went through them one by one, and I wrote a series of blog posts summarizing other people's research on this. And there are actually by now many reviews of research that you can find in the scientific literature and the psychological literature. And the truth of the matter is, there just is not the evidence out there for all these awful claims. It's just simply not there. And in fact, when you start to look at the actual scientific evidence, there's far more evidence for positive benefits of computer games especially, but positive benefits of the computer in many, many ways. But most of the studies have been on computer games. Let me just give you a couple of examples of such studies. So one study was done. It was done by Columbia University a couple years ago, And they did this massive study of 3,000 children from the age of 6 to 12. And they determined how many hours a day each child was playing video games based on interviewing the parents about this. And independently of that, based on teacher interviews, for each of these child, they assessed how many friends this person has, how socially competent they are, how emotionally stable they are, and even how well they're doing in school in terms of performance in school. On every single one of those measures, the children who were playing more than 5 hours a week of video games were doing better than the children who played less than 5 hours a week. Significantly better on every single one of those measures. There are now also lots of studies on cognitive effects of playing video games. The first observation, which was widely reported in the scientific press, but not in the public press, was that the average IQ of people who play video games is higher than the average IQ of otherwise equivalent people who don't play video games. So that's a correlation. It doesn't prove cause and effect. Maybe it's just that people, these video games are very difficult, and so maybe you're only attracted to them if you have a high IQ. So maybe it's not that playing the video games builds IQ. Maybe it's just that high IQ people are more likely to play video games than are people who have lower IQs. So then they did these experiments. They took people who don't play video games. Almost all of them were young women because it's hard to find young men who don't play video games. So they identified these college girls, college young women who don't play video games, and they required as part of the experiment, if you're in the experiment, you've got to play, and if you're in the experimental condition, you've got to play this video game whether you want to or not. You play it a certain number of hours a week for a certain number of weeks, and they're tested on various cognitive tests before and after. And lo and behold, their ability on these tests increases dramatically as a result. And these are the same kind of tests that are tested on IQ tests. So the results, you can find journal articles, and if the first place to look is on my blog post, where you could find a blog post called Cognitive Benefits of Video Games. But don't believe what I say there, believe the articles. Go and look at the original articles that I'm reviewing there, and the review articles. Now, many studies of this sort. What researchers have concluded is nobody has ever found any method to increase basic reasoning capacity, basic cognitive skills that is more powerful than video games. They're now recommending that old people like me should play video games so we can preserve our memory and our judgment and our quick thinking and so on and so forth. And the other thing, that there is now more and more neurobrain research showing, lo and behold, as you might expect, if cognitive abilities are being built, the brain is also being built by playing video games. Those parts of the brain that are involved in spatial perception, in memory, and quick thinking and so forth actually grow. The brain is like a muscle. So the truth of the matter is, these video games, the reason that they're so-called addictive is because they're so challenging. Then children wouldn't be doing them if they weren't challenging, because they wouldn't be interesting. They'd be quickly bored by them. But there's no end to how challenging they are. Now, I think that the question of addiction to the video game, I think that's a legitimate question, but I think we have to be careful about how we're using the word addiction. So there's a lot of scare headlines that you read. There was a headline in one of the major newspapers in the United States not long ago. The headline was "Digital Heroin." Oh my God, digital heroin. You let your kid play a video game, it's like giving them heroin. And so where does that come from? So I read the article, and there are other articles along this line too. So there's a certain amount of research that shows that and it's a little fuzzy how you actually determine this out, and it's debatable whether it's true, but I believe it's true. So when you're playing a video game, in the brain, there's a release of the neurotransmitter dopamine. And dopamine in the brain is also released when you take heroin or when you take cocaine. But surprise, surprise, dopamine is released whenever you're doing anything that's fun. Dopamine is the transmitter in the pleasure pathway. So the only way that video games would not cause a release of dopamine is if they were no fun. So I suppose maybe somebody could develop a video game that was no fun, and then it wouldn't be addictive because nobody would want to play it, and it also wouldn't release dopamine. But that also means we can't do anything else that's fun. So if we tried to deprive our children of activities that cause dopamine release in the brain, we would have to deprive them of everything that's fun. The truth of the matter is, when you come down to it, the amount of dopamine released when you're playing a video game is nothing like the amount of dopamine that's released when you take a shot of cocaine or heroin. It's on a different order of magnitude. It's the same order of magnitude as if you eat a cupcake or you are about to do checkmate in chess or anything else that you're doing that is pleasurable and satisfying. So don't be put off by those kind of scare headlines. Now, there's one sense in which I'm sympathetic with the argument that this is addictive, but I would rather not use the word addictive. Because these games are so interesting and they're so attractive, children may be doing these things at the expense of doing other things. They may be doing these things instead of having a pleasant dinner with you at home. But maybe you're on your damn cell phone at dinner too, so it's not just the children, right? So I think it makes sense in the family to say, look, we want certain times when we're all together and we're not going to be distracted. And, let's have a rule, no video games during dinner time. Let's have certain family times where we're not all into video games. Let's have certain family times when we're doing all these things together. And I can even understand, I know one school that democratically made a decision. We're going to have 2 hours during the day when we ask that nobody play video games. And this came from the students. And the reason it came from the students is that they were somewhat frustrated. If they wanted to play an outdoor game, they couldn't get enough kids together because too many of them were saying, well, I'll come outdoors in a little while, but I've got to finish my video game first. And then by the time they finished the video game, it was too late to have the game. So the kids themselves decided, let's synchronize our outdoor time to these 2-hour periods, and we will have this rule about no video games during those 2 hours. And I could kind of understand that rule. You're not depriving people of video game play during most of the day. You're saying for a couple of hours, let's do this thing together. I have a person I know, kind of a colleague, who's a psychotherapist, and he specializes in treating people with so-called video game addiction, but he doesn't call it addiction. So a typical thing that'll happen, he claims, I asked him, so how does a session usually go? And he says, somebody will come to me, usually some young man or some teenager, and he'll say, I'm just a lazy, good-for-nothing person. All I do is play video games. And so the first thing he'll say to them is, well, tell me what games you play. And they'll say, well, I play this game, and he'll say, so what level have you reached in that game? And this guy knows video games. He's a video game player. And they'll say, well, I've reached such and such a level. And so he'll right off say, well, we can rule out that you're lazy. You're not lazy. You couldn't possibly reach. That's a really difficult game. I could never reach that level in that game. So you are certainly not lazy. So what is the problem? And so then the guy will say, well, because I'm playing video games all the time and I'm not doing the other things that even I think I should be doing in life, and certainly that other people think I should be doing in life. And so then he'll say, oh, well, this is a problem a lot of people have. Let's not call it addiction. That's so pathological sounding. Let's call it a time management problem. A lot of us spend more time doing things we like to do than other kinds of things that maybe we ought to be doing that would in the long range be good for us. So let's do away with this sense of this as pathology. Let's talk about this as a normal kind of thing. And now we can have a real conversation. Now we can figure out, so you love to play video games, but you think you're playing too much of it. How might you think of a strategy? Can we think together of a strategy to limit the time to a video game? Not to abolish video game, but to limit it somewhat so you can do these other things that you think are important to you. That's, I think, the attitude that we should have. There's actually now the World Health Organization, sadly, now has a questionnaire that assesses video game disorder. And I took that questionnaire. I'm not a video game player, but I took that questionnaire imagining my 11-year-old self when I was into fishing. And instead of video gaming, I substituted fishing. And I would, without question, have come out as having a fishing addiction when I was 11 years old if they had given me that questionnaire. On almost every question, I had to say, yes, that's true of me. Yeah, I fish whenever I get a chance. I dream about fishing at night. I think about fishing even when I'm not fishing. Sometimes I lie about fishing. I tell people I've gone to school and I actually went fishing. So I would have had a fishing addiction. Fortunately, nobody called it that. They just said he was into fishing, right? So I prefer to say, well, he's really into video games. It turns out a lot of people are into video games, and it's no surprise to me that a lot of people are into video games. They really are incredibly fascinating and challenging, and games in which you're learning an awful lot. But it is true that people are doing more of it than many of us would like to do because we can't interact with them. If we're not playing video games with them, we can't interact with them, and we miss that. And they may be missing something by virtue of the fact that they're spending so much time on this and not enough time on other things. It's also the case that many children are playing video games more than even they would want to because they're not allowed to do other things. So the same child who's not allowed, at least in the United States, to go out and have real world adventures in the physical world, get away from adults, play with other children, do risky things in the real world, which children want to do, they can have adventures, virtual adventures online. And that's a substitute for it. There was a study that I actually referred to in Free to Learn. So the study was done a number of years ago. And this was actually done of people who, all the children in this study had computers because the study was done online. It was an online survey. And they asked the children in this survey, right now, if you had a choice between playing your favorite video game or going out to the park and playing with your friends without any adults there telling you what to do, which would you choose? And something like 88% of them, I don't remember the exact number, but it was well over 80%, said, I would prefer to play out in the park with my friends, but that's not a possibility. That's not an option. Even if I'm allowed, my friends aren't allowed. So I would go out to the park and I'd be all alone. And so, of course, I would come back, and on the computer, I can make contact with my friends. There was also there's a whole book written on why teenagers are on social media so much. And basically, they're on social media so much because that's the only way they can communicate with other teenagers without their parents listening in or without adults snooping on them. And as soon as their parents learn Facebook, they're on to something else, right? Kids have always needed to get away from adults, and we're not allowing them to get away from adults to interact with one another, but they can still do it online. If we deprive them from doing it online, we're depriving them entirely of being able to do this. So anyway, that's probably a longer answer than you asked for, but I do tend to get on a soap opera about that.
Hello.
Hello.
I have a question about, well, I'm a child psychotherapist. And is there any, in your research, are there any connection between the free development and the primary attachment theory? Because actually, if I refer to Winnicott, for example, the play and the creativity for the baby is in relationship or in interaction with the primary relation person, the mother.
I'm not sure I understand the question. Relationship between play and primary attachment, is that what you said?
Yes, are there any connections in
and
your
what do you mean
opinion?
by primary attachment? Just so
Well,
I'm
in the
clear.
quality of the attachment between the baby and the mother.
And the mother,
or the
okay.
other, yes.
Yeah. So here's the interesting thing about attachment. Children are naturally bond and want to attach to their caretaker. And the first attachment object usually is the mother. And so we think about attachment between the baby and the mother. But the job of childhood is to go beyond attachment. The job of childhood is to learn to attach to a lot of people, to make a lot of social relationships. So what we observe in hunter-gatherer cultures, interestingly, is that the child becomes bonded to all the adults in the culture and all the other children in the culture. If children just became bonded to their parents, if children were designed just to become bonded to their mother or their father or their two together, that would not have been a very adaptive characteristic throughout human history, because chances are pretty good in a hunter-gatherer culture that you're parent would be dead before you grow up. So you better well be attached to a lot of people. You better well be in a situation where a lot of people care about you. In the typical one of the hunter-gatherer bands that I'm familiar with, because one of my colleagues at Boston College lived with these group, the FA in Africa. When the baby is born, the first thing that happens, even before the mother holds the baby, is the baby is passed around to everybody in the band. Everybody holds the baby. Everybody snuggles with the baby. It's sort of like a declaration. This is the baby of all of us. And so the baby is kind of, the mother has a somewhat special relation, but among the FA and some other hunter-gatherer groups, it's even the case that all of the lactating mothers can nurse any baby. So it's not even that all the nursing is occurring with just the mother. Nevertheless, the mother plays a kind of special role, and the children tend to, when cases of need, they tend to prefer to be with the mother. But by the age of 4, and this is true every place that I've looked, it's very important for children to get away from their mom and dad. They want to explore, they want to get independent. I think it's a mistake if we think of attachment as something that's supposed to retain that initial kind of bond over time. It's great. Of course, children love their parents and parents love their children, but it's not the attachment this would be pathological if the child wants to be next to you all the time. I think we're seeing too much attachment today because the reason is children are not able. So we see college students who are still tied to their mom. You know, they're calling their mom after every class to tell them, ask for advice about what they should do. They haven't been able to become disattached because they haven't had enough experience being away from their parents, learning how to deal, make friends, deal with people other than their mom or their immediate family. So kind of I think a lot of natural parenting came out of the attachment literature, and I think that's wonderful. But I also think sometimes it gets carried too far, and we think of attachment as something that continues on in that same kind of way, when it really is for infants.
What I meant is then your research and a correlation between, for example, a baby who had a good attachment or a toddler has a good attachment to his mom will be better in free play or in self-directed play.
Yeah, okay, I'm sorry I misunderstood you. There is a lot of data about that. If you have a secure attachment, that gives you the security and confidence to go out and explore more than that. So children in the hunter-gatherer cultures, although I say they're attached not just to the mother, they're attached really to everybody in the band, but they're very secure. And they're even more secure because they know that it's not just their mother, it's everybody in the band that I'm attached to and will help care for me. And so it's no surprise that there've actually been studies shown that hunter-gatherer children, by the time they're 4, are much braver, much ready to explore, much ready to be independent than children in our culture who are less securely attached to any kind of a community.
So one last question, yeah?
Thank you. Well, I would like to thank the associations that made it possible for you, Peter, to be here, because you are definitely my dream coming true. It's been fantastic listening to you. It's been it's been an honor, really, to be here. The ideas that you talk about is something that are, when you talked about you being the kind of person who needs to have the evidence, I'm the person who feels things with the heart. And for me, even before my son was born, I knew that I was not going to put him through the horrors of the so-called conventional education system. Now, the question is, where do you get that village? Where do you get that, group, that band of people who are like-minded, so that you can make it possible for your children if it wasn't possible for you? In a way that obviously now we are more connected than ever, and at the same time, we are more disconnected than we ever were.
Right.
In a different
right.
sense, maybe, of that word. So how do you practically do that?
How do you bring people together who have... So this is really... I think you've identified what we're trying to do with the Alliance for Self-Directed Education. So we're trying, there's all these people out there who are doing unschooling. Many of them don't even know there's a lot of other people doing it. There are these people who have democratic schools, but they're not really much in communication with the people doing unschooling. So what we're doing with the Alliance for Self-Directed Education is we're becoming a place where people can become members of the Alliance. They're indicating where they live and so on and so forth. And we are forming in the United States local groups of people who are doing or interested in self-directed education. So they can meet with one another in their local communities. We're encouraging them to meet in the libraries because we love to see libraries be centers for self-directed education. And so more and more now, people who previously didn't even know there were a lot of other people doing unschooling, is the usual case, in their community. They now know they can find out a list of people doing it from us, and they can make connections with one another and find a group, and they can get their kids together. Their kids otherwise might have difficulty finding friends who are, if the other kids are all in school during the day, or the other kids are always doing schoolwork and they're not allowed to play. This was a way to find friends who are in a similar situation with them, and they can get together. So it's one of the things we're doing. I think that is a big key to the movement forward of self-directed education, is instead of thinking of it, many people quite understandably get interested in this, not because they're interested in saving the world. Quite understandably, they're interested in saving their child. That's got to be your first priority. So the people who go into this, they're doing it because they see their child is suffering. And they find that their child, many people, they say, I found my child again, now that my child is no longer in school. I see that smile, I see that glow, I see that. So they're very happy with doing that. But we're trying to say is that's great, but your child will even be more happy if there are other children doing this that your child is connected with, and the world will become a better place. If you come out about this, you advertise the fact you're doing this, you make it clear, you connect with other people doing it. So I think that that's a really key step to making this flourish. We have to stop thinking of ourselves as just isolated individuals, families doing this for the sake of our own children, and start thinking of, we're doing this, of course, for our own children. That has to be number one. But we're also doing this for the sake of the children of the world. And by the way, it's also an honor for me to be here, and I am so honored by all of you who find this to be something worth thinking about. And many of you I know are struggling with it and trying to make it an occurrence. So I think we should applaud everybody here.